The security guard's hand clamped around Robert Miller's wrist before the sound of the surf, even faded fingers digging in hard, as if he had just been caught stealing something instead of standing barefoot in the sand with his daughter 10 steps behind him. "You don't belong here," the guard said, low and sharp eyes already sliding past Robert as if he were disposable. Private section. Robert didn't pull away. He didn't argue. He just stood there, chest tight, salt wind pressing his shirt against his ribs, trying to understand how a quiet morning at the beach had turned into public humiliation in front of half a dozen strangers. Grace froze behind him, 11 years old enough to read faces, old enough to feel shame that wasn't hers. Robert opened his mouth to explain, then stopped. He had learned over 60 years of living in America that explanations only mattered when someone had already decided you were worth listening to. And right now, no one had. 10 minutes earlier, none of this existed. The morning had been simple. Cool sand, pale sunlight, the steady, patient breathing of the Atlantic rolling in and out like an old friend who knew when to keep quiet. Robert had chosen this stretch of the Maine coast for that exact reason. Not flashy, not loud. A place where retirees walked their dogs at dawn and fishermen nodded without asking questions. A place where a man who spent his life being overlooked could disappear without effort. Grace had kicked off her sneakers and run ahead, laughing, her voice thin and bright against the wind. Robert followed more slowly, shoulders rounded, eyes down, carrying the weight he always carried. The weight of being a single father at 60. The weight of being a man everyone assumed was near the end, not still standing in the middle. Then he had seen her. Not her face at first, just posture. Straight-backed, unmistakably controlled even at rest. A woman standing near the rocks, back turned to the beach, one hand braced against the stone, the other tugging at a thin linen wrap. Robert's steps slowed without him realizing it. His mind registered something before his logic caught up. Authority. Presence. The kind that didn't belong on a quiet beach. The wind surged hard off the water. The linen snapped loose. For a fraction of a second, the wrap flew open. Pale skin. Bare shoulders. The clean, unguarded line of a woman who had not meant to be seen. Robert's breath caught. His eyes lifted on instinct, not desire. Recognition slammed into him like cold water. Margaret Collins, Chief Executive Officer, co-founder, 62 years old. The woman whose voice could silence a boardroom with a pause. The woman whose signature decided who stayed employed and who quietly vanished from payroll. Topless, exposed, real. And then she turned. Her eyes found him immediately. There was no scream, no dramatic gasp, just a stillness that dropped between them, heavy and absolute. Margaret pulled the wrap closed with one smooth motion, jaw-tightening gaze locked on his face. Not angry. Worse. Measuring. Robert looked away too late. The moment burned itself into him. Not the skin. The look. The look that said she had seen everything, including him. He lowered his head, heat rushing up his neck, heart pounding so hard it felt audible. 60 years old and still capable of making a mistake this stupid, this unforgivable. Grace called his name. He didn't answer. By the time he dared look back, Margaret was already walking away, sandals biting into wet sand. Shoulders, squared spine rigid. The linen wrap fluttered once, then settled as if nothing had happened. Robert stood there long after she disappeared, the sound of the ocean dull and distant, his mind racing forward to consequences. He didn't think about embarrassment. He thought about termination letters, health insurance, mortgage payments, college funds, everything that could unravel because of 1 second he could never take back. Dad Grace said quietly, touching his arm. "Are you okay?" He nodded too fast. "Yeah. Just thinking." They moved farther down the beach, away from the rocks, away from whatever invisible line he had crossed. Robert tried to ground himself in ordinary things. The grit of sand between his toes, the distant cry of gulls, Grace crouching to examine a shell, her brow furrowed in concentration. Normal. This was supposed to be normal. The guard approached from behind without warning. Heavy boots, radio crackling, authority borrowed, not earned. "You," he said, pointing at Robert's chest. "I told you, this area's restricted." Robert turned slowly. "We're just walking," he said, voice steady, even. "Didn't see any signs." The guard's eyes flicked to Grace, then back, irritation sharpening. "This section's reserved for residents and guests of the Collins property." The name landed like a hammer. Robert felt it then. The shift, the invisible weight pressing down. He had wandered unknowingly onto her land, onto her rules, onto her side of the world. "I'm sorry," Robert said. Not because he believed he was wrong, because apologies were currency, and he had learned to spend them early. The guard reached for his arm anyway. That was when Grace stepped forward. "She didn't mean to," she said. Voice clear, chin lifted. Not defiant, honest. The wind did that. The guard blinked momentarily, thrown off. Children disrupted scripts. Robert's throat tightened. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, grounding both of them. "It's okay," he murmured, though it wasn't. A few people nearby slowed, sensing tension. Eyes lingered, judgments formed. An older man, rumpled shirt, no wristwatch worth noticing. A kid with Yad on her knees, easy to categorize, easier to dismiss. The guard's grip loosened, but did not release. "You need to leave. Now." Robert nodded. He always nodded. He turned, guiding Grace away, every step heavy with the knowledge that someone was watching from somewhere higher, somewhere safer. He did not see Margaret then, but he felt her presence like a pressure change in the air. Grace didn't speak until they reached the wooden path back to the parking lot. Her voice came small. "Did you do something bad?" Robert stopped. He knelt so they were eye level, the boards warm under his knees. He searched her face for fear, for doubt. He found neither. Just concern. "No," he said slowly. "But sometimes people think you did. And that can feel the same." She nodded, absorbing that quietly. Too quietly. As they walked on, Robert's phone vibrated in his pocket. One short buzz. Then another. He didn't need to look to know who it would be from. The beach behind them continued as if nothing had happened. Waves rolled in. The wind shifted. Somewhere among the rocks, Margaret Collins stood very still, staring out at the water. Her reflection fractured in the glass of a nearby window, already deciding what this moment would cost and who would pay for it. Robert Miller, walking away with his daughter, had no idea that he had just stepped into a story far larger than himself. One that would test not only his dignity, but the quiet power he had spent a lifetime keeping hidden. Robert didn't sleep that night. He lay on the narrow motel bed, listening to the ocean batter the rocks beyond the thin walls, each wave sounding like a question he couldn't answer. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image, Margaret Collins turning toward him, her expression unreadable, the wind snapping linen like a warning. Grace slept curled on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek, breathing slow and even. She trusted the world more than he did. Or maybe she trusted him to keep it from breaking. At dawn, Robert rose quietly and stepped outside. The parking lot was empty except for a single pickup truck and a line of gulls perched on a rusted railing. The air smelled of salt and wet wood. He rubbed his face, feeling the grit of exhaustion in his eyes. 60 years old, and still carrying the weight of consequences that hadn't arrived yet, but felt inevitable. His phone buzzed again. This time he looked. An email. No subject line. Just a sender address he knew by heart. Margaret Collins. His pulse spiked. He didn't open it. Not yet. He slipped the phone back into his pocket as if it might burn him. At breakfast, Grace pushed scrambled eggs around her plate, quieter than usual. She glanced up at him, then down again. "Are we going home today?" He hesitated. "We planned 2 nights." She nodded, but her shoulders stayed tight. The guard yesterday, he was mad. Robert folded his hands carefully. Sometimes people use rules to feel powerful. Was he right? No. The word came out firmer than he expected. But that doesn't always stop them. She studied him, then asked, "Are you in trouble?" There it was. The question he'd been avoiding. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But if I am, it won't be because I did something wrong." Grace accepted that with a small nod. She was old enough to understand fairness, and young enough to believe it still mattered. They went back to the beach later that morning, choosing a public stretch far from the rocks. Robert felt eyes on him anyway. Or maybe that was just his nerves, sharpening everything. He caught himself scanning faces, expecting another uniform, another hand reaching for his arm. Margaret did not appear. By early afternoon, the email pressed against his thoughts like a weight. He couldn't enjoy the sound of the water or the warmth of the sun, knowing it sat unopened, waiting. He finally stepped away from Grace, who was collecting driftwood near the shore, and checked his phone. The message was short. "We need to speak. Not about yesterday. About what comes next. Meet me at the harbour house at 6. Margaret." No threats. No explanations. Just certainty. Robert stared at the words until they blurred. About what comes next. That was worse than anger. That meant planning. At 6 sharp, he stood outside the harbour house, a weathered restaurant perched above the docks. He had changed into his cleanest shirt, pressed by hand that morning. He looked like what he was, a man trying to be taken seriously in a place that didn't owe him that courtesy. Margaret was already inside. She sat alone at a corner table posture, straight hands folded, a glass of water untouched. Fully dressed, fully armored. The linen wrap was gone, replaced by a navy cardigan and slacks. She could have been anywhere. She made every place hers. Robert approached slowly. "Miss Collins." She lifted her gaze. "Sit down, Robert." "Not Margaret. Not yet." He did. For a moment, neither spoke. The clink of silverware and low murmur of conversation filled the space between them. "I'm not here to apologize again," Robert said finally. "I've done that enough." Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Good. I wouldn't accept it." He met her eyes, then steady despite the fear coiling in his chest. "Then why am I here?" She leaned back slightly. "Because yesterday exposed something that's been wrong for a long time." His brow furrowed. "With me? With the way people think they're allowed to handle situations they don't understand." Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "That guard had no authority to touch you. He overstepped." Robert blinked. He hadn't expected that. "He said it was your property." "It is." She didn't flinch. "That doesn't make it his to abuse." Silence fell again, heavier this time. She continued. "I watched the entire exchange from the terrace. I didn't intervene immediately because I wanted to see what would happen." Robert's jaw tightened. And you did exactly what people like him count on." Her gaze held his. "You complied. You protected your daughter. You swallowed your anger." He exhaled slowly. "That's survival." "Yes." Her voice softened a fraction. "It is." She reached into her bag and placed something on the table. A folded document. The restaurant's light caught the letterhead. "Horizon Marketing Group." Robert's heart thudded. "Is this—" "Not a termination," she said, reading his face. "If it were you, wouldn't be sitting here." He didn't relax. She slid the document closer. "It's an audit request. Internal. Discreet." He stared at it. "I'm a designer. You're also the only senior employee who's been in every division this company has ever had." Her eyes sharpened. "You see patterns others miss." Robert hesitated. "Why me? Because you're invisible," she said bluntly. "And because you don't scare easily. You're scared now, but you didn't lash out. You didn't lie. You didn't play victim." The word stung. "I don't play anything." "I know." She paused. "That's the point." The weight of the moment settled over him. This wasn't about the beach. Not really. That had just cracked the surface. "You're asking me to look for what he said, slowly, exactly. For where power gets misused when no one thinks I'm watching." He thought of the guard's hand on his wrist, of the casual certainty, of how quickly dignity could be stripped away. "And if I say no?" She nodded once. "Then we finish dinner, go our separate ways, and nothing changes." He studied her face, the controlled lines, the restraint, the loneliness she hadn't named. "And if I say yes, then things will get uncomfortable." Her eyes held his. "For both of us." A server approached, interrupting the moment. Margaret ordered black coffee. Robert asked for water. His throat was too dry for anything else. When the server left, Margaret spoke again, quieter now. "This has nothing to do with what you saw yesterday." He believed her. That frightened him more. He thought of Grace asleep in the motel bed, of the future he'd been trying to protect by staying small. "What happens if I find something you don't like?" he asked. Her gaze didn't waver. "Then we deal with it." Something shifted in him then. Not courage, not defiance, something older, a sense of being seen, not as a liability, but as a measure. "I'll look," he said. Margaret inclined her head. "Good." As they stood to leave, she added, "One more thing." He waited. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For assuming compliance meant weakness." She met his eyes. "I won't make that mistake again." Outside, the evening air was cool and sharp. The harbour lights flickered on one by one. Robert walked back toward the motel with a strange clarity settling over him. Whatever this was becoming, it was no longer about embarrassment or fear. It was about leverage, about lines crossed quietly and corrected loudly. Behind him, Margaret Collins remained standing on the dock, watching the water darken, fully aware that by choosing Robert Miller, she had set forces in motion that would not stop neatly and would not spare anyone who had mistaken silence for consent. Monday arrived without ceremony, grey and heavy, the kind of morning that pressed down on the city and made even familiar streets feel narrower. Robert sat at his kitchen table, coffee untouched, scrolling through the audit access Margaret had granted him late Sunday night. Read only, she had said. For now. The company's internal systems opened like a quiet maze, folders nested inside folders' dates, stretching back decades. He moved through them with the ease of someone who had learned long ago how to watch without being seen. Grace stood by the door, backpack slung over one shoulder. "You're quiet," she said. "I'm thinking," Robert replied, closing the laptop. "About work." She hesitated, then nodded. "You always think like that when something big is coming." He offered a small smile. "You're very observant." She shrugged. "You taught me." After she left, the apartment fell into a silence, broken only by the distant sound of traffic. Robert turned the laptop back on and began again this time, focusing not on design files or marketing metrics, but on internal approvals. Expense reports, vendor contracts, security services. Security. The name of the private firm guarding the main property surfaced quickly. Smaller than expected. Recently acquired. Paid above market rates. The paperwork was clean. Too clean. Robert leaned back, eyes narrowing. He had seen this before. In another company. Another decade. Different faces. Same pattern. At the office, he kept his head down. The bullpen buzzed with low conversation keyboards clicking, phones ringing. Nothing looked different. That was the point. He watched people instead of screens. Who avoided eye contact. Who lingered near closed doors. Who spoke softly when certain names came up. Margaret passed through once heels sharp against the floor, expression neutral. She did not look at him. That too was intentional. By Wednesday, he had mapped enough threads to feel the tension coiling. Money moving sideways, authority delegated without oversight, complaints buried under layers of polite language. The guard at the beach had not been an anomaly. He had been a symptom. Robert requested lunch with Tom Avery, head of operations, framed it as a design workflow question. Tom agreed without suspicion. They ate in the company cafeteria, plastic trays between them. "You've been here longer than most," Tom said, casually spearing a piece of chicken. "You ever think about retirement?" Robert shrugged. "Some days." Tom laughed. "I envy that. Margaret never will." Robert watched him carefully. "You think so?" Tom lowered his voice. "This company is her life. She trusts people. Sometimes too much." "Trust is expensive," Robert said lightly. Tom glanced at him, something flickering in his eyes. "You sound like my father." That night, Robert worked late, long after most of the floor had emptied. He accessed archived complaint logs, the ones marked resolved without action. Names repeated. Same departments. Same language. Unprofessional behavior. Misunderstanding. No further action required. His phone vibrated. A message from Margaret. "Find anything yet?" He typed erased, typed again. Patterns, not proof. Her reply came quickly. "That's enough for now. Keep going." On Friday, Grace asked why he was late again. He knelt to her level hands on her shoulders. "I'm helping fix something that's been broken." She studied his face. "Will it break us?" The question landed hard. "No," he said firm. "I won't let it." The following week, the first crack showed. An email circulated from Human Resources announcing an external review of security practices. Language neutral, tone calm. The office buzzed anyway. People sensed movement even when they didn't understand it. Tom Avery stopped by Robert's desk. "You hear about this?" Robert looked up, feigning surprise. "Just saw it." Tom frowned. "Feels sudden?" "Sometimes things only feel sudden when you haven't been paying attention," Robert said. Tom stared at him a moment longer than necessary, then walked away. That afternoon, Robert received a private calendar invite. Margaret. Her office. After hours. The room smelled faintly of leather and old paper. City lights glowed beyond the windows. Margaret stood by the desk, jacket, off sleeves rolled up. She looked tired. Not weak, just human. "You were right," she said without preamble. "It's wider than I thought." Robert nodded. "It usually is." She turned to face him fully. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" He met her gaze. "Because no one was asking." Silence stretched. She exhaled slowly. "That's on me." She moved behind the desk and slid a folder toward him. "The board will meet in 3 weeks. I need something solid before then." "You'll have it," Robert said. She studied him. "You're calm." "I've lived through worse storms," he replied. "This one just has better furniture." A corner of her mouth lifted. "You're still underestimated." "Always have been." That weekend, they returned to Maine. Public beach this time. No guards, no ropes. The ocean was rougher, the sky overcast. Grace walked between them, kicking stones into the surf. Margaret kept her distance, respectful, careful. Grace watched her closely, saying little. When Margaret offered to help with a kite, tangled in its string, Grace hesitated, then handed it over without a word. Later, as Grace ran ahead, Margaret spoke quietly. "She doesn't trust easily." "She shouldn't," Robert said. Margaret nodded. "Neither should you." On Tuesday, the story broke internally. An anonymous report leaked to the board detailing abuses of authority within contracted security teams. Names omitted. Evidence cited. The office shifted from buzz to tension. Tom Avery confronted Robert in the hallway. "This you, Robert?" Didn't flinch. "What makes you think that?" Tom's jaw tightened. "You've been asking questions. So have others." Tom leaned closer. "Be careful." Robert held his ground. "You too." That evening, Margaret called him to her office again. Her voice was controlled, but something electric hummed beneath it. "They're pushing back," she said, "threatening legal action, discrediting the source." "Expected," Robert replied. "They always do." She watched him. "You're not afraid?" "I am," he said simply. "I just don't let it drive." She nodded slowly. "I've built this company on control. I forgot what it costs." Robert thought of the guard's hand, of Grace's quiet question. "Control without accountability rots," he said. Margaret looked out of the window. City lights reflected in her eyes. "When this is over, everything changes." "Yes," Robert agreed. "That's the point." As he left the building, night air cool against his skin, Robert felt the weight shift again. The storm was no longer distant. It was forming overhead, dark and inevitable. At home, Grace was waiting up, book open but unread. "Did you fix it?" she asked. "Not yet," he said, sitting beside her. "But we're close." She leaned against him, trusting his steadiness. Robert stared into the quiet apartment, fully aware that the next weeks would test not just his resolve, but the hidden authority he had carried all his life without naming it. And when the time came, the truth would surface sharp and undeniable, and no one who had mistaken silence for weakness would remain untouched. The summons came sooner than Robert expected, stamped urgent, routed through legal and marked confidential, the kind of message that did not ask whether you were ready. He read it once, then again, feeling the familiar tightening in his chest as years of restraint aligned into something sharper. The board wanted answers. Not later. Not filtered. Now. The conference room on the top floor smelled of polished wood and old money. 12 seats, only 9 filled. The rest stood empty like warnings. Margaret sat at the head of the table, spine, straight hands folded, face composed into something colder than calm. To her right outside, counsel murmured to a junior associate. To her left, 2 board members avoided looking at each other, eyes fixed on screens they were no longer reading. Robert took the seat Margaret indicated without ceremony. He placed a thin folder on the table. No logos, no dramatic tabs, just facts stripped of decoration. One of the board members cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller." He began tone polite in the way people use when they believe politeness is leverage. "We understand you've been assisting the chief executive with an internal review." Robert met his gaze evenly. "That's correct." "And you're not part of compliance," another voice added. "Or legal." "No," Robert said. "I'm part of the company." A few brows furrowed. Margaret did not move. The first man leaned back. "Then perhaps you can explain why your findings have escalated so quickly." Robert opened the folder and slid a single page forward. "Because they were already there. I didn't create anything. I just stopped looking away." Silence settled dense and uncomfortable. He continued, voice steady. For years, Horizon outsourced security for properties events and executive travel. On paper, the firm met every requirement. In practice, they operated with minimal oversight. Complaints were logged, reclassified, and quietly resolved without action. Patterns emerged. Targeting based on perceived status, physical overreach, intimidation framed as enforcement. One board member shifted. "You're referring to an isolated incident." Robert's eyes flicked briefly to Margaret, then back. "No, I'm referring to a system." The associate whispered something to counsel. Margaret finally spoke. "Mr. Miller's findings align with independent data we commissioned last week. That drew attention. You commissioned that without board approval." Someone snapped. Margaret's voice did not rise. "I exercised my authority." Robert felt the room tighten further. This was no longer about him. It never had been. A third board member leaned forward. "What exactly is your role in this?" "Mr. Miller." Robert inhaled slowly. "I'm the person who sees what happens when rules are enforced without accountability. And why should we trust your interpretation?" He held their gaze one by one. "Because I've spent my entire career being underestimated. People speak freely around men. They don't see as threats." A beat passed, then another. Margaret watched him carefully now, not intervening. Robert continued. "The incident that triggered this review involved me and my daughter. On a public beach. No signage. No warning. A contracted guard placed his hands on me and ordered us away. Not because of safety. Because of perceived ownership." A murmur rippled through the room. One moment, counsel interjected. "Are you alleging misconduct tied to the chief executive's personal property?" "I'm stating a fact," Robert said, "and presenting evidence that it wasn't isolated." He slid the rest of the documents forward. Dates, names, settlements, redactions that told their own story. The room went quiet in a way that felt final. Afterward, Margaret dismissed everyone but Robert. The door closed softly behind the last board member, sealing the room in silence. "You didn't hold back," she said. "You asked for the truth," he replied. She nodded once. "They'll vote by Friday. Some will try to contain it. Others will want blood. And you?" Her eyes hardened. "I want it done right." He believed her. That night the phone calls began. Anonymous numbers, voicemails with no words, just breathing. Robert deleted them without listening twice. He had crossed a line. He knew it. Lines once crossed did not politely reset. At home, Grace sensed the shift immediately. "People are mad," she said, not asking. "Yes." "At you. At what I represent." She absorbed that quietly. "Will they stop?" "Eventually," he said. "But not before they try." The next morning, headlines broke in the business section. Not scandal. Not yet. Just questions. Horizon Marketing initiates independent review of security practices. Market analysts speculated. Employees whispered. Emails flew. At the office, eyes followed Robert differently now. Some with curiosity, some with caution, a few with open resentment. Tom Avery passed him in the hallway without stopping. At lunch, a junior designer approached Robert's table, hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said, barely above a whisper. Then she was gone. By Thursday, the pressure became visible. Vendors withdrew bids, lawyers drafted statements, the board scheduled an emergency session. Margaret called Robert late that night. "They're offering a settlement. Quiet, generous. For whom? For everyone except the people it would hurt most." Robert closed his eyes. "That's not accountability." "No," she agreed. "It's avoidance. And I won't take it." A pause. "They'll try to remove you." "I know. They'll try to discredit you." "I know. They may succeed." Robert thought of the beach, of the guard's grip, of Grace's question. Then at least the truth will be on record. Friday came heavy and bright. The board reconvened. This time Robert was not invited. Margaret faced them alone. By late afternoon, her assistant appeared at Robert's desk. "She wants to see you." Margaret stood by the window when he entered. City stretched beneath her like a map she had redrawn too many times. She turned slowly. "They voted," she said, "and I remain CEO. Conditional." He waited. "They've agreed to terminate the Security Contracts Fund, an independent oversight body, and release findings publicly. That's not conditional. They also demanded a scapegoat." Robert felt it then. The pivot. The reveal he had been expecting since the beach, and you refused. "I offered one," she said quietly. "Myself." His breath caught. "They didn't take it," she continued. "They took you." Silence roared. "They want you gone," she said. "Officially for restructuring. Unofficially to send a message." Robert absorbed that without flinching. He had known the cost. Margaret's voice tightened. "I can fight it." He shook his head slowly. "No. You've already done what matters." She stepped closer. "You shouldn't have to pay for this." "I chose to," he said. "Long before they noticed." She studied him, eyes searching. "You're not who they think you are." A small smile touched his mouth. "Neither are you." That evening, Robert packed his desk in silence. No speeches, no applause. Just the weight of an ending that was also a beginning. At home, Grace listened as he explained. She did not cry. She took his hand. "Did you do the right thing?" "Yes." "Then we'll be okay." He believed her. Somewhere across the city, Margaret Collins signed a statement that would change the company forever. And somewhere beyond the glass and steel, a quiet man who had been underestimated his entire life walked into uncertainty with his dignity intact, knowing that when the truth finally finished unfolding, the world would understand who had truly held the power all along. The morning after his departure, Robert woke before dawn to a silence that felt earned rather than empty. No emails, no calls, no calendar alerts dictating the shape of his day. He stood at the kitchen window watching the city lighten inch by inch, thinking about how strange it was that freedom could feel heavier than obligation. Grace padded in hair-tangled eyes, sharp despite the hour. "You're not late," she said. noticing the absence of urgency. "No," Robert replied. "I'm exactly on time." She studied him, then smiled, small and certain. "Good." By mid-morning, the first article landed. Not buried. Front page of the business section. Not framed as a scandal, but as a reckoning. Horizon releases findings. Oversight expanded. Senior designer exits amid reform. His name appeared once. No photograph, no commentary. Just a line that read like a footnote to something much larger. His phone rang an hour later. An unfamiliar number. He let it go to voicemail. Then another. And another. By noon, the messages stacked up. Recruiters, consultants, a reporter who left her number twice, voice tight with urgency. Robert listened without returning any of them. He made sandwiches instead, ate slowly, took Grace to school, and walked the long way back, hands in his pockets, breathing in the cool air, as if learning it again. At 3 p.m, a black sedan idled outside his building. The driver did not get out. Robert noticed it anyway. He always noticed. When the knock came, it was firm but polite. He opened the door to find a woman in a grey coat posture, military eyes alert. "Mr. Miller," she said. "My name is Elaine Porter. I represent a private advisory firm retained by the board at Horizon." "I no longer work there," Robert replied evenly. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." He did not invite her in. She didn't ask. "We'd like to discuss your severance," she continued, "and the non-disclosure provisions." Robert smiled faintly. There were none. Her lips pressed together. "We can make them." "No," he said, gentle but final. "You can't." She studied him, then something recalibrating behind her eyes. "You're confident. I'm informed." A pause. "May I come in?" He stepped aside. Elaine took in the apartment quickly. The books, the framed photographs, Grace's shoes by the door. She sat when he gestured, crossing one leg carefully. "The board is concerned," she said. "That you may speak." "I already have," Robert replied. "Publicly. Through documentation. They believe you have more." "I believe they're right." Silence settled. Elaine leaned forward. What would it take to ensure discretion? Robert met her gaze. "Accountability." She exhaled. "That's not a term boards like." "Then they should get used to it." She stood, smoothing her coat. "This isn't over." "No," Robert agreed. "It's just no longer quiet." After she left, Robert finally returned a call. Not a recruiter. Not a reporter. "Margaret." "I tried to stop them from sending someone," she said. "They don't listen when they're afraid." I noticed he replied, "I should have protected you better." "You protected the truth," he said. "That's rarer." A breath on the line. "They're digging into your past. They won't find anything they can use." "You're sure I've been careful," he said. "For a long time." She hesitated. Why Robert looked at the window again, at the reflection of a man the world had never bothered to measure correctly. "Because I learned early that power isn't something you announce. It's something you prepare." That night, Grace asked if they were moving. He shook his head. "Not unless we choose to." She nodded, satisfied. Good. I like my room. The following days unfolded like a controlled burn. More articles. Whispers of lawsuits. The security firm dissolved under scrutiny. Names surfaced. Apologies followed. None reached the people who had needed them most. On Thursday, Robert received an encrypted email. No greeting, just coordinates, a time, and a signature he hadn't used in 20 years. He stared at it for a long moment, then deleted the message and wrote the information down by hand. The building was unmarked, brick and steel, no signage. Inside, the air was cool and still, the kind of place where voices never rose. A man at the desk checked his name against a list and nodded once. They're waiting. The room beyond was circular. Glass walls, city visible in every direction. 5 people stood when he entered. All older, all sharp-eyed, all familiar in the way that mattered. You took your time, one of them said. I was busy, Robert replied. Another smiled. We saw. Margaret Collins stood apart, watching. Not surprised, not confused, just attentive. You never told them, she said, quietly. They never asked, Robert replied. The man at the center spoke. Robert Miller is not your name. No, Robert said. It's what I needed it to be. Silence fell thick and reverent. For decades, the man continued. You built systems, quiet ones, oversight frameworks, ethics boards. You left them behind when they became visible. Robert nodded. Visibility compromises effectiveness. Margaret's breath caught. You let them fire you. I let them reveal themselves, he said. The man smiled. The oversight body Horizon just funded will answer to us. Margaret turned slowly. You engineered this. I corrected it, Robert said. You gave it permission. She absorbed that, eyes bright with something like awe. What happens now? Robert looked around the room, then back at her. Now the work becomes public, and slower, and harder. And I go back to being underestimated, he said. It's where I'm most useful. Later, as they stood alone by the glass, Margaret spoke without looking at him. They'll never know who you really are. Robert watched the city breathe below them. They don't need to. Grace met him at the door that evening, holding a piece of paper. We learned about checks and balances today, she said. They're to stop people from having too much power. He knelt, meeting her eyes. That's right. She smiled. Then you did good. He held her close, feeling the steady truth of her heartbeat, understanding at last that power did not always roar. Sometimes it watched. Sometimes it waited. And sometimes, when the moment demanded it, it stepped forward quietly and changed everything. The first subpoena arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick paper, precise language, the kind of document that pretended neutrality while promising impact. Robert read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it beside the others. 3 so far. Different jurisdictions. Same questions. Who knew what? When? Why nothing had stopped it sooner. Grace watched from the doorway, backpack on, shoes half-tied. That looks important. It is, Robert said. But it can wait until after breakfast. She rolled her eyes, the universal gesture of children unconvinced by adult calm. then sat. He poured cereal, steady hands, even breath. Control was not the absence of fear. It was the discipline of not letting fear dictate tempo. By mid-morning, the news cycle shifted from speculation to consequence. Congressional aides floated comments about oversight hearings. Advocacy groups issued statements. The phrase systemic failure appeared more than once. Robert noted it without reaction. Language always lagged behind reality. His phone rang again. This time he answered. Robert Margaret said, "No preamble, no armor, just his name. They've requested my testimony." "I assumed they would. They want you there." He closed his eyes briefly. "As what?" "As an expert witness." Silence held for a beat. Then softer. "As yourself." He looked out the window at the street below, ordinary and unaware. "That's not how this works." "That's exactly how it works now," she replied. "They're trying to understand how a company missed what was happening inside it. They'll ask about systems, culture, silence, and they'll want a face," Robert said. "Yes. I won't be the story," he said calmly. "You already are," Margaret replied. "The question is whether you get to shape it." They met later that day in a quiet office borrowed from a non-profit partner. No signage, no staff hovering, just two people and a table between them. Margaret looked different lately, less rigid, not weaker, more precise. "They're circling," she said, placing a stack of documents down. "Lobbyists, former partners, everyone who benefited from the old arrangement." "They always do," Robert said. She studied him. "You're not afraid of them?" "I'm wary," he corrected. "There's a difference." She leaned back. "You could disappear. Let this burn out. No one would blame you." He met her gaze. Then nothing would change. Her jaw tightened. "You're asking me to do something dangerous." "No," he said. "I'm asking you to do something honest." The hearing room was colder than expected. Marble walls, flags, cameras lining the back like silent predators. Robert took his seat at the long table nameplate, plain. Consultant, advisor, no titles that hinted at anything else. Margaret sat several chairs away. Posture composed, eyes forward. When she glanced at him, there was no fear there, only resolve. The questions began predictably. Process, oversight, risk management. Margaret answered with clarity, owning what she had missed without deflecting. Some committee members nodded, others sharpened their tone. Then they turned to Robert. Mr. Miller, a congressman, began, voice smooth. "You were not in a compliance role. Why were you in a position to identify these issues?" Robert folded his hands. "Because I was not in a compliance role." A pause. "Explain." "I was invisible," he said evenly. "People spoke freely around me. They showed me how power behaved when it believed it wasn't being observed." Murmurs rippled. Another voice cut in. "Are you claiming systemic abuse?" "I'm stating that systems reflect values," Robert replied. "And values reveal themselves in small moments, long before they explode into scandals." A senator leaned forward. Such as Robert didn't hesitate. A security guard placing his hands on a man and his child because he believed ownership justified force. Margaret's breath stilled. The room leaned in. That moment, Robert continued, did not begin on a beach. It began years earlier, when complaints were minimized, when oversight was treated as optional, when silence was rewarded. "Why didn't you report this sooner?" another asked. "Because no one was listening," Robert said. "And because speaking without leverage is just noise." A murmur. The word leverage hung heavy. Afterward, the headlines were sharper. Testimony raises questions about corporate oversight culture. Calls for reform grow. Robert avoided reading them. He walked instead. Long routes, unfamiliar neighborhoods. He let the city remind him that institutions rose and fell, but streets endured. That night, Margaret called again. Her voice was steady but tired. "They're asking about you. They always do after hearings. They want to know who you really are." Robert smiled faintly. "Tell them the truth. That you're a retired designer who noticed patterns. That I'm a citizen who paid attention." Silence. Then quietly, "You're protecting me." "I'm protecting the work," he said. Grace noticed the shift before anyone else. The way people spoke to her father differently when they passed him on the sidewalk. The way teachers smiled a little longer. "You're on the news," she said one evening. Not accusing, just observing. "Yes." "Are you famous?" "No," he replied. "I'm accountable." She considered that. "Is that better?" "It lasts longer." Weeks passed, investigations expanded, boards restructured. The oversight body announced its first public guidelines. Names were named. Not all. Enough. Margaret resigned quietly one Friday afternoon. Not forced. Strategic. She issued a statement accepting responsibility and committing to reform from outside the executive seat. Markets wobbled, then stabilized. The company endured. They met one last time before she left her office. The walls were bare now, the view unchanged. "I never asked who you really were," she said. "You didn't need to, I know," she replied. "But I want to." Robert looked at her, weighing. "Some roles only work when they're unclaimed." She nodded slowly. "Then let me say this without labels. You changed the outcome. So did you." She hesitated. "What happens next for you?" He thought of the circular room, the glass walls, the people who waited. "The same thing that's always happened," he said. "I watch. I advise. I step in when silence becomes dangerous." "And for us?" she asked quietly. He met her eyes. "That depends on whether you want a life without armor." A long pause, then a small, genuine smile. "I'm learning." That night, Robert tucked Grace in, listening to her breathing even out. He sat by the window afterward, city lights blinking like distant signals, aware that the storm had passed, but the work had not ended. Power was not a throne or a title. It was a responsibility that moved quietly through rooms, changing hands only when someone was willing to carry it, without applause. The silence after Margaret's resignation was louder than any scandal. It settled over the city like a held breath, the kind that made people speak more carefully, walk a little straighter, check who might be listening. Robert felt it the moment he stepped outside his building the next morning. Conversations paused, eyes followed, not hostile, curious, measuring. Grace noticed it too. "They're staring again," she said, as they waited at the crosswalk. "They're thinking," Robert replied. "About what?" "About whether things can actually change." She nodded, as if that made sense. At 11, she understood more than most adults. She always had. The call came just after noon, not encrypted this time, a public number, the oversight body's interim director. Calm voice, direct language, an invitation to consult. Not quietly, not anonymously. On record. Robert listened without interrupting. When the man finished, he said, "I'll advise on systems, not personalities. That's exactly what we need," the director replied. Robert agreed to meet the following week. He did not tell Grace yet. He wanted to understand the shape of the work before letting it enter their home. By mid-week, the backlash began to surface in sharper forms. Opinion pieces questioning motives. Anonymous sources suggesting hidden agendas. A former executive hinted on cable news that Robert Miller was not who he claimed to be, that no one emerged from nowhere without backing. Robert watched the clip, once expression unreadable, then turned off the television. That evening, there was a knock at the door. 2 quick taps, then one slower. Margaret stood in the hallway. No jacket hair, loose, a folder tucked under her arm. She looked smaller without the office around her. Not diminished, unarmored. "I wasn't sure you'd answer," she said. "I was," Robert replied, stepping aside. They sat at the kitchen table. No agenda, no assistants hovering, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the city breathing beyond the window. "They're trying to rewrite the story," Margaret said, placing the folder down. "Make it about ambition or revenge." "Those narratives are familiar," Robert said. She watched him. "They're also dangerous." He met her gaze. "Only if people believe them." She exhaled. "I've been asked to testify again. Publicly. About you. About me," he echoed. "They want a name, a history, something they can hold up and dissect." "And what did you say?" "That I won't speak about. What I don't fully understand," she replied. "And that neither should they." He nodded. That was wise. She hesitated, then opened the folder. Inside were printouts, old articles, academic papers, footnotes leading to other footnotes, a quiet map of influence built over decades. "I found this," she said softly. "Not through the board, through my own research." Robert did not look at the papers. "Then you know." "I know enough," she said. "You helped build oversight frameworks in 3 industries before Horizon ever existed. You consulted for federal agencies under different names. You walked away when the work became performative." He leaned back. "You're very thorough." "I had to be," she said, "because I needed to know whether I had followed a man or a mirage." And she met his eyes. A man. The word landed with weight. Grace appeared in the doorway, sensing the shift. She looked at Margaret, then at Robert. "Hi," she said simply. Margaret smiled. Not professionally. Honestly. "Hi, Grace." They spoke for a few minutes about school, about a book Grace was reading about nothing that mattered and everything that did. Margaret listened more than she spoke. When Grace returned to her room, Margaret's shoulders eased. "She watches everything Margaret said." "She learned early," Robert replied. Margaret gathered the folder but did not leave. "I don't know what comes next," she said quietly. "For me." "That's not a weakness," Robert said. "It's an opening." She nodded. "I've been offered positions, boards, think tanks. All of them want the appearance of reform without the discomfort. And I want to build something that doesn't need me to be feared." He studied her face. "That will take time." "I have time," she said. "What I don't have is guidance." He considered. "Guidance is earned." Her mouth curved slightly. "Then I'll earn it." The oversight meeting the following week was held in a converted courthouse. High ceilings, sunlight slanting through tall windows. The director introduced Robert plainly. No embellishment, no secrets. Robert spoke last. He spoke about incentives, about silence, about how systems trained people to look away. He did not name villains. He named patterns. When questions came, he answered without deflection. When accusations surfaced, he dismantled them with facts. By the end, the room had shifted. Not in mood, in posture. Afterward, a young analyst approached him, eyes bright. "I didn't know you could say those things out loud." "You can," Robert replied, "if you're willing to stand where the answers lead." That night, Grace asked, "Are you done fixing things?" "No," Robert said. "I'm just starting to teach others how." She smiled. "Good. You're good at teaching." The attacks intensified for a while. Online. Off the record. A shadow followed him once, then disappeared. Robert adjusted his routes, trusted his instincts. He had done this before. Margaret kept her distance publicly, but they spoke often. Walks, coffee, conversations that ranged from governance to grief. She spoke of her husband's death, of how control had become her shield. Robert listened without offering solutions. One evening, as they stood on the river walk, watching the lights ripple across dark water, Margaret spoke softly. "Do you ever regret stepping in?" Robert watched the current. Regret assumes there was a safer choice. She considered that. "And if this costs you peace?" He looked at her then. "Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's alignment." She nodded slowly. "Then I want to align." The final article ran on a Sunday. A long piece, balanced, thorough. It traced the arc from the beach incident to the hearings to the reforms now underway. It mentioned Robert only once at the end, quoting an unnamed advisor. "Power reveals itself in how it treats those it believes cannot push back." Grace read it over his shoulder. "That's you," she said. "It's a lot of people," he replied. That night, Robert stood at the window again, city quieting below, aware that his anonymity had thinned, but not vanished. He had never needed recognition. He needed outcomes. Behind him, Margaret's reflection appeared in the glass. Not beside him yet, not fully joined, but closer than before. The work was far from over. It never was. But for the first time in a long while, the direction felt right, and the ground beneath his feet felt solid, not because the world had changed, but because he no longer needed it to misunderstand him in order to move forward. The first envelope arrived without a return address. Thick cream paper, handwriting careful and old-fashioned, as if whoever sent it believed courtesy still mattered. Robert held it for a moment before opening it, feeling the familiar prickle along his spine that came when something quiet carried weight. Inside was a single letter, no signature, just a sentence written in steady ink. "We know who you are now. The work will continue. So will the resistance." He folded the paper once and placed it in the drawer where he kept things he did not want Grace to find. Not secrets. Precautions. The days that followed took on a strange rhythm. Mornings were ordinary. Breakfast, school drop-offs, walks through streets that smelled of coffee and rain. Afternoons were not. Calls from oversight teams in other states, requests to review frameworks, invitations to speak that he declined more often than he accepted. He chose carefully now. Visibility was a tool, not a reward. Grace adjusted faster than he expected. Children always did when adults were honest. She noticed the way people spoke to him differently at school meetings. The careful politeness, the curiosity held back by respect. One afternoon, as they walked home, she asked, "Are you important?" Robert considered the question. "I'm responsible," he said. She nodded. "That sounds harder." "It is," he agreed. Margaret moved through her own transition with quiet discipline. She no longer had an office, no assistant filtering calls, no schedule imposed by others. At first, the freedom unsettled her. She filled notebooks with ideas she didn't yet trust herself to act on. She walked long distances, learning the city as if for the first time. Sometimes, she joined Robert and Grace for dinner, always asking, before always leaving, before it felt like intrusion. One evening, as Grace cleared the table, Margaret lingered by the sink. Sleeves rolled up, hands submerged in warm water. "I used to think rest was wasted motion," she said, not looking up. "And now?" Robert asked. "And now I think exhaustion was the point," she replied. "If you're tired enough, you stop asking whether what you're building makes sense." Robert dried a plate slowly. "That's how systems protect themselves." She glanced at him. Something like relief crossing her face. "I'm glad you say things plainly." Someone leaked the contents of the oversight body's draft recommendations the following week. The backlash was immediate. Editorials accused the reforms of overreach. Lobbyists called it an attack on private enterprise. A familiar narrative reasserted itself, polished and loud. Robert was asked to respond publicly. He declined. Instead, he wrote a memo, clear, methodical. He sent it to the director, who circulated it internally. The next day, 3 more oversight bodies requested consultations. The resistance was real, but so was momentum. The second envelope arrived on a Friday. This one bore a crest. Inside was an invitation to a closed-door symposium in Washington. Limited attendance. Senior policymakers. The topic was corporate accountability. Robert recognized the subtext. They wanted legitimacy without surrender. He set the invitation aside. That night, as rain streaked the windows, Margaret sat across from him, fingers wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. "They're circling again," she said. "They always will," Robert replied. She hesitated. "They're offering me a seat, advisory council, high profile. And "And they want you there too," she said, "as proof." Robert leaned back. "Proof of what?" "That reform doesn't threaten stability," she said. "That people like you can be integrated." He smiled faintly. Integrated is a polite word for neutralized. She met his gaze. "That's what scares me." "Then you already know the answer," he said. She exhaled slowly. "I'm still learning how to walk away from power without feeling like I'm abandoning responsibility." Robert watched the rain slide down the glass. Power doesn't disappear when you walk away from institutions. It just changes hands. And who holds it now? She asked quietly. He thought of the oversight bodies, the analysts, the junior designer who had whispered thank you weeks earlier. "More people than before," he said. "That's progress." The third envelope came from an unexpected place. A school. Grace's school. Robert read it twice, then smiled despite himself. They were inviting him to speak at a civic engagement assembly. Nothing dramatic. Just talk about responsibility. Listening. Speaking up. Grace read over his shoulder. "You should do it," she said. "Why?" "Because they won't listen to grown-ups unless they think they're important," she replied, matter of fact. He laughed softly. "You've figured out the system." The assembly was held in the gym, folding chairs, hand-painted posters, children fidgeting, parents lining the walls. Robert stood at the microphone, feeling oddly more nervous than he had before committees and cameras. He spoke simply, about noticing, about asking questions when something felt wrong, about how silence could be comfortable but costly. He did not mention companies or hearings. He mentioned a beach, a rule, a moment that asked him to choose. Afterward, a boy approached him, eyes bright. "What if people don't like you when you speak up?" Robert knelt so they were level. "Then you learn who was only comfortable with you when you were quiet." The boy nodded, absorbing that. On the walk home, Grace slipped her hand into his. "You didn't sound scary," she said. "Good," Robert replied. "Change shouldn't need fear." That night, Margaret stood on his balcony city lights, stretching out like a constellation of intentions. "I've been thinking," she said, "about us." He waited. "I don't want a partnership built on crisis," she continued, "or on admiration. I want something slower, quieter, honest." Robert turned to her. "Those things take patience." She smiled. "I have more than I thought." The next morning, Robert declined the Washington invitation. He accepted a different one instead. A long-term advisory role with the oversight body, limited visibility, real authority. Systems work, the kind that endured. The resistance did not disappear. It never would. But it fractured. Without a single target, without a convenient villain, it struggled to hold shape. Late one evening, as Robert locked the door, he found another envelope waiting. This one smaller. No message. Just a card inside blank, except for a single line written in careful script. "Thank you for choosing the harder path." He placed it in the drawer beside the first. Grace was already asleep. Margaret would arrive later, not to plan, not to strategize, just to be present. Robert stood by the window one last time, watching the city settle, aware that the work ahead would be quieter now, less dramatic, but deeper. That was how real change always moved. Not with spectacle, but with endurance carried forward by people willing to remain when attention drifted elsewhere. The first real quiet came months later, slipping in so gently, Robert almost missed it. No envelopes, no calls asking for guidance, no headlines waiting to be answered. Just a stretch of days that belonged to themselves again. He woke before dawn out of habit, then lay there listening to the building breathe, realizing there was nowhere urgent he needed to be. Grace noticed the change in him before he did. She stopped checking his phone when it buzzed. She stopped asking whether he would be late. One evening, as she spread her homework across the table, she said, "You're home more." "I am," Robert said. "Does that mean it's over?" He thought for a moment. "It means it's stable." She accepted that, which told him she had learned something important. Not everything ended with a bang. Some things simply settled. Margaret's life had slowed too, though in a different way. She no longer moved through rooms as if she were responsible for every outcome. She listened more than she spoke. She laughed more easily, surprised each time by the sound. They met without schedules now. Walks along the river. Quiet dinners. Conversations that wandered instead of aiming somewhere specific. One afternoon they drove back to Maine. Not for closure. Not to reclaim anything. Just because Grace had asked what the ocean looked like in the fall. The town was quieter than Robert remembered. Fewer tourists. More locals. The beach stretched wide and empty, the wind sharp, the water darker. They walked without speaking for a while, the sound of their steps swallowed by sand. Grace ran ahead, scarf trailing behind her, stopping to collect stones she deemed interesting. Margaret stayed beside Robert, hands tucked into her coat pockets. "This is where it started," she said. Not accusing, not dramatic. "This is where it showed itself." Robert replied. She nodded. "I've replayed that day more times than I can count." "So have I." She stopped walking, turning to face the water. "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" He watched the waves break steady and indifferent. "No," he said. "I wish it had been handled differently by the people who thought they could act without consequence. But the moment itself, no." She studied him. "You don't regret discomfort." "I regret silence," he said. They stood there, the three of them, framed against grey sky and restless sea. No guards, no signs. Just open space, Grace called out, holding up a stone shaped like a heart, laughing when the wind nearly stole it from her hand. Margaret smiled without thinking. Later, as they sat on a driftwood log, Margaret spoke again, her voice quieter. "I spent most of my life believing leadership meant never being exposed, and now I think exposure is the point," she said. "It's how you learn whether the structure holds." Robert considered that. "Only if you're willing to see the cracks." She met his eyes. "You were." He didn't correct her. He had been willing because he had already lived without illusions. That was the advantage of being underestimated for most of a lifetime. Back in the city, the world had moved on to other controversies. New names, new failures. Robert read about them without engagement. He offered guidance when asked, declined when it felt performative. The oversight frameworks began to show results. Quiet ones. Fewer complaints dismissed. More questions asked early. Small changes that would never trend, but would matter to the people inside them. One evening, Grace brought home a permission slip for a school trip. "We're visiting City Hall," she said. "They're teaching us how decisions get made." Robert smiled. "That's useful." She hesitated. "Will they listen to kids?" "Sometimes," he said. "More than they listen to adults." Margaret joined them for dinner that night, arriving with a loaf of bread still warm from the bakery downstairs. As they ate, Grace watched the two of them closely, her eyes sharp in the way only children's could be. "You're different together," Grace said suddenly. Margaret froze, then relaxed. "Different how?" "You're quieter," Grace said. "But you don't look tired." Robert felt something loosen in his chest. Margaret reached for her glass, buying time. "That's because we don't have to perform for each other," Margaret said carefully. Grace nodded. "That sounds nice." Later. After Grace had gone to bed, Margaret stood by the window, arms folded loosely. "She sees everything she said." "She trusts what she sees," Robert replied. Margaret turned to him. "I don't want to rush anything. I don't want to make promises I don't understand yet." He met her gaze. "Then don't." A long pause followed, comfortable and unforced. "I want to be here," she said finally. "Not as a project. Not as a phase. Just here." Robert nodded once. "That's enough." Weeks passed, then months. No dramatic declarations, no grand reconciliations, just consistency. Margaret learned Grace's routines. Grace learned Margaret's silences. Robert learned what it felt like to share space without guarding it. One afternoon, a reporter emailed Robert asking for a retrospective interview. A final word. He read the message twice, then deleted it. The story was no longer his to narrate. It belonged to the systems now and to the people inside them. That evening, as they walked home together, Margaret slipped her hand into his without ceremony. The gesture was small, unannounced, completely intentional. Robert looked at her, surprised by how natural it felt. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said quietly. He squeezed her hand. "Neither am I." At home, Grace was waiting curled up on the couch with a book, one foot tucked under her leg. She glanced up at them, took in the joined hands, and smiled without comment. No questions, no declarations, just acceptance. Later, after the lights were out and the apartment had settled into sleep, Robert lay awake for a while, listening to the city hum beyond the walls. He thought of all the moments that had led here: the beach, the hand on his wrist, the choice to speak, the cost of being heard. He understood something then that had taken him decades to articulate. Power was not the ability to command or to disappear. It was the capacity to remain present when leaving would be easier. Beside him, Margaret slept peacefully, her breathing steady. In the next room, Grace dreamed, unburdened by the weight of unspoken things. Outside, the city continued indifferent and vast. Inside, something smaller and more resilient held its ground, not because it demanded attention, but because it no longer needed permission to exist. The last change arrived quietly, the way real endings always did, without ceremony or warning. It came on a Sunday morning, when the light slipped through the curtains just right, touching the edges of the room without demanding anything in return. Robert woke before the city, listening to the slow rhythm of 3 lives breathing under one roof, and understood that nothing else needed to be proved. Grace moved through the apartment with the easy confidence of a child who felt safe. She made toast without asking, humming to herself, leaving crumbs on the counter without apology. Margaret watched her from the doorway, arms folded loosely, a small smile lingering as if she were memorizing a moment she knew would matter later. She no longer carried herself like someone waiting to be tested. She carried herself like someone who had already chosen. Robert poured coffee and stood by the window, the city stretching outward in muted color. The world beyond them had not become fair or gentle. Companies still cut corners. Power still tested limits. Silence still tempted those who benefited from it. But something essential had shifted, not everywhere, not all at once, just enough to matter. Margaret joined him close, but not pressing. The Oversight Council finalized the last framework yesterday, she said softly. They're rolling it out nationally. He nodded. Good. They credited you. Not by name. By principle. That's better, he replied. She leaned her shoulder against his. You could have taken credit. I took responsibility, he said. Credit fades. Later that afternoon, they walked to the park leaves beginning to turn the air, carrying the first hint of autumn. Grace ran ahead, laughing, stopping to inspect every dog and puddle as if the world had been created for her alone. Parents watched from benches. Strangers nodded. No one stared. No one whispered. Margaret sat beside Robert as Grace climbed a low tree, steady but cautious. I used to believe stability came from control, she said. Now I think it comes from consistency. Robert watched Grace reach a branch and pause, considering her next move. Consistency earns trust, he said. Margaret smiled. She trusts you completely. She learned it wasn't optional, he replied. That evening, as the sky darkened and the city lights blinked on, Robert received a final message from the Oversight Director. Short, grateful, definitive. The work would continue. The systems would evolve. His role would remain advisory, distant enough to stay honest, close enough to intervene when needed. He set the phone down without ceremony. Dinner was simple. Conversation easier than it had ever been. Grace talked about school, about a project on civic responsibility, about how rules were supposed to protect people, not frighten them. Margaret listened with full attention. Robert felt a quiet satisfaction settle in his chest. Not pride, not relief. Something deeper and steadier. After Grace went to bed, Margaret stood on the balcony, city lights reflecting in her eyes. I used to think my legacy would be what I built, she said. Now I think it will be what I stopped. Robert joined her, the night air cool and honest. That's still building, he said. She nodded. Just differently. They stood there a long time, not speaking, not needing to. The city moved below them, unaware and unstoppable as it always had been. Somewhere new conflicts were forming. Somewhere someone was being underestimated. Somewhere silence was choosing sides. Inside their apartment, there was none of that. Just the quiet certainty of people who had survived exposure and come out aligned. When Robert finally lay down, sleep came easily. Not because the world was safe, but because his place in it was clear. He had not chased power. He had not sought recognition. He had done what needed to be done when it mattered, and then stepped back without resentment. That was the part no one talked about. Knowing when to leave the center and let the work stand on its own. Morning would come. Grace would wake. Margaret would make coffee. The city would continue to test itself, and Robert would remain what he had always been, beneath every borrowed role and hidden name, a man who understood that dignity did not require permission, and that the quietest choices often carried the greatest weight. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of a moment when speaking up changed more than just the outcome, take a second to subscribe and comment 3 words that matter to you.